In the towering glass skyscrapers of Qatar's financial district, wealthy oil executive Rashid Al-Qadri thought he had control over everything: his billion-dollar empire, his pristine reputation, his carefully orchestrated life. But a devastating car accident left him with injuries that threatened to destroy not just his body, but the very foundation of who he believed himself to be. When he hired Zara Okafor, a skilled physiotherapist from Nigeria, he expected nothing more than professional rehabilitation. What he didn't expect was that her gentle hands and perceptive questions would unlock secrets buried so deep he had forgotten they existed. What those therapy sessions revealed would shatter everything Rashid thought he knew about his past and force him to confront a truth that would change both their lives forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The screech of metal against asphalt echoed through the rain-soaked streets of Doha as Rashid Al-Qadri's black Bentley Continental collided with the concrete barrier at 80 kilometers per hour. The man who had spent his entire adult life building an oil and gas empire worth over $3 billion now lay unconscious in the wreckage, his spine compressed, his left leg shattered in 4 places, and his right shoulder dislocated so severely that surgeons weren't certain he would ever regain full mobility. For 6 weeks, Rashid remained in the private wing of Doha's most exclusive medical facility, surrounded by the finest specialists money could buy. His brother Faisal handled business affairs, while teams of lawyers managed the media, ensuring that news of the accident remained contained. The official story was simple: a minor incident, quick recovery expected, business as usual. But behind the polished veneer of controlled information, Rashid's reality was far grimmer. At 45 years old, the man who had never shown weakness to anyone, not to business rivals, not to government ministers, not even to his own family, could barely lift his head without waves of excruciating pain shooting through his spine. His left leg remained immobilized in a complex external fixation device that resembled medieval torture equipment more than modern medicine. Worst of all, his dominant right arm hung useless at his side, the shoulder joint so damaged that even the simplest movements left him gasping. Dr. Hassan Mahmoud, Qatar's leading orthopedic surgeon, delivered the prognosis with clinical detachment. Mr. Al-Qadri, your injuries are severe, but not irreversible. However, the path to recovery will require intensive physiotherapy for at least 18 months, possibly longer. Your spine has been stabilized, but the surrounding musculature needs complete rehabilitation. Your leg will heal, but you'll need to relearn how to walk properly. And your shoulder, he paused, consulting his tablet. The rotator cuff damage is extensive. Without proper therapy, you may never regain more than 60% mobility. Rashid stared at the ceiling of his hospital room, the weight of those words settling over him like a suffocating blanket. 60% mobility, 18 months of therapy, the strongest man in Qatar's energy sector reduced to a broken shell, dependent on others for the most basic functions. "I want the best," Rashid said finally, his voice hoarse from weeks of pain medication. "Money is no object. Find me the best physiotherapist in the world." Dr. Mahmoud nodded. "I'll compile a list of specialists. There are excellent rehabilitation centers in Switzerland, Germany, the United States." "No," Rashid's interruption was sharp despite his weakness. "I won't be treated abroad like some invalid seeking charity. Find someone who can come here to my home." Complete discretion. What followed was an exhaustive international search conducted by Rashid's personal staff. They contacted rehabilitation centers across Europe and North America, seeking physiotherapists willing to relocate to Qatar for an extended private contract. The compensation offered was astronomical, nearly $500,000 for 18 months of exclusive service, plus luxury accommodation and all expenses paid. Yet one by one, the most qualified candidates declined. Some cited other commitments. Others were uncomfortable with the level of isolation the position required. Several simply found the terms too restrictive. Rashid's insistence on absolute confidentiality meant they would essentially disappear from their professional networks for over a year. It was Rashid's executive assistant, Mariam, who finally discovered Zara Okafor's credentials buried in the database of a London-based medical recruitment agency. Unlike the other candidates, Zara's resume told a story of someone who had worked in challenging, isolated conditions before. She had spent 3 years providing physiotherapy services in remote Nigerian villages through medical outreach programs. She had worked with war veterans in makeshift clinics along the Somali border. Most importantly, she had completed advanced training in neurological rehabilitation and trauma recovery, exactly what Rashid's complex injuries required. But what caught Mariam's attention wasn't just Zara's professional qualifications. It was a small detail in her personal statement. "I believe healing happens not just through technical skill, but through understanding the whole person, their fears, their hopes, and the stories that shape who they are." When Mariam presented Zara's file to Rashid, he was initially skeptical. The photograph showed a woman in her early 30s, with kind eyes and a gentle smile, wearing simple clothing as she worked with a child in what appeared to be a rural clinic. She looked nothing like the polished, expensive specialists he had expected. "She's from Nigeria," Mariam explained, watching Rashid's expression carefully. "Her credentials are impeccable. She graduated top of her class from the University of London's physiotherapy program, then completed specialized training in Switzerland before returning to Africa for humanitarian work. She speaks fluent Arabic, which she learned during a 2-year assignment in Sudan." Rashid studied the file more carefully. Zara Okafor had worked with patients suffering from severe spinal injuries, complex fractures, and neurological trauma. Exactly the combination of issues he faced. Her success rates were remarkable, and the testimonials from both colleagues and patients painted a picture of someone with extraordinary skill and dedication. "Why would someone with these qualifications be available for private work?" Rashid asked suspiciously. "Someone this qualified should be running their own clinic, not taking private contracts." Mariam had anticipated this question. According to the agency, she recently completed a long-term assignment and was looking for something different. The compensation we're offering would allow her to fund her own mobile clinic project back in Nigeria afterward. She sees this as an opportunity to make a significant impact when she returns home. Despite his reservations about hiring someone so different from his usual expectations, Rashid found himself intrigued. Perhaps it was the medication, or perhaps it was simply desperation. But something about Zara's background appealed to him. Here was someone who had chosen to work in difficult conditions, who had dedicated her career to healing rather than simply maximizing profit. "Arrange a video interview," he said finally. "But I want complete background checks first. Everything: education, work history, personal references, financial records. If I'm going to trust someone with my recovery, I need to know exactly who they are." The background investigation took 2 weeks and cost nearly $50,000. When the results came back, they revealed a woman of remarkable integrity and skill, but also someone with her own mysteries. Zara had grown up in Lagos, the daughter of a university professor and a nurse. She had excelled academically, earning scholarships that took her from Nigeria to London and then to specialized training programs across Europe. But there were gaps in her personal history, periods where her whereabouts were unclear, references to family circumstances that had necessitated her humanitarian work choices. Most intriguingly, the investigators discovered that Zara had once declined a lucrative position with a prestigious London rehabilitation centre, choosing instead to work in refugee camps. When asked about this decision in a professional interview from 2 years earlier, she had simply said, "Some experiences teach you that healing isn't just about the body. Sometimes the greatest injuries are the ones we can't see." The video interview took place on a Tuesday afternoon, with Rashid propped up in his hospital bed and Zara connecting from a small apartment in London where she was completing paperwork between assignments. Despite the clinical setting and formal circumstances, their conversation quickly moved beyond standard interview questions. "Mr. Al-Qadri," Zara said, her voice carrying a slight British accent overlaying her Nigerian roots, "I've reviewed your medical files, and I want to be honest with you. Your recovery will be physically demanding, but the greater challenge may be psychological. Injuries like yours don't just affect the body, they can fundamentally change how someone sees themselves, their capabilities, their future. Are you prepared for that kind of work?" The question caught Rashid off guard. Most of the other candidates had focused on technical details, treatment protocols, expected timelines. None had asked whether he was prepared for the emotional aspects of recovery. "I've built a $3 billion company from nothing," he replied, a hint of his old arrogance creeping into his voice. "I think I can handle whatever physical therapy requires." Zara smiled gently, but her eyes remained serious. Building a company requires vision, determination, and the ability to control outcomes through effort and strategy. Recovery from trauma often requires the opposite, learning to surrender control, to trust the process, to accept help. It means confronting fears and limitations you may never have acknowledged before. That's a different kind of strength, Mr. Al-Qadri. Are you prepared to develop that strength? For the first time since his accident, Rashid found himself without an immediate answer. This woman, this stranger from halfway around the world, had identified something in him that he hadn't even recognized himself. The fear that recovery might require him to become someone fundamentally different from the man he had always been. "I'm prepared to do whatever it takes," he said finally, and something in his voice suggested he meant it. Zara nodded. "Then I'll accept your offer, Mr. Al-Qadri, but I want you to understand something from the beginning. My job isn't just to restore your physical function. My job is to help you become whole again. Sometimes that means the therapy goes deeper than muscles and bones. Are you comfortable with that?" Rashid agreed, though he had no idea what he was truly committing to. Within a week, arrangements were made for Zara to relocate to Doha. She would live in the guest quarters of Rashid's compound, with access to a fully equipped therapy room that had been hastily constructed in what used to be his private gym. The contract was signed, the confidentiality agreements were executed, and Zara Okafor became the latest addition to Rashid Al-Qadri's carefully controlled world. Neither of them could have predicted that their first therapy session would begin to unravel secrets that had been buried for over 30 years, or that the healing process would reveal connections between them that went far deeper than either had imagined. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. 3 days after Zara Okafor arrived in Doha, Rashid Al-Qadri sat in his wheelchair at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse study, watching her transform his former gym into something entirely different. Where gleaming chrome weight machines and mirrors had once reflected his physical dominance, she had created a space that felt more like a healing sanctuary than a medical facility. The walls, previously stark white and intimidating, now featured soft earth tones and carefully positioned lighting that seemed to breathe warmth into the room. Where motivational slogans about conquest and victory had hung, Zara had placed simple artwork, abstract pieces that suggested movement and flow rather than dominance and power. Most surprisingly, she had introduced elements that seemed completely foreign to his sterile, controlled environment. A small water fountain that provided gentle background sound, plants that seemed to pulse with life, and what appeared to be traditional African textiles draped carefully along one wall. "It's not what I expected," Rashid muttered to his brother Faisal, who had stopped by to review business documents that required Rashid's signature. Faisal glanced toward the therapy room, then back at his brother. "You hired her for her skills, not her decorating choices. Besides, the doctors say she has the best credentials of anyone you interviewed. What does it matter if she wants to hang some fabric on the walls?" But Rashid found himself inexplicably bothered by the changes. For 25 years, every space in his compound had been designed to project power, control, and uncompromising success. Now this woman had walked in and, with seemingly simple adjustments, had created something that felt different, softer, more human. He wasn't sure he liked it. The first scheduled therapy session was set for Thursday morning at 10 o'clock. Rashid had his assistant wheel him into the room precisely on time, expecting a professional, clinical encounter similar to his hospital experiences. Instead, he found Zara sitting cross-legged on a mat in the center of the room, her eyes closed, breathing slowly and deeply. "Are you ready to begin?" he asked, his tone sharper than necessary. Zara opened her eyes slowly, smiled, and rose gracefully to her feet. "I was waiting for you to arrive, Mr. Al-Qadri. But first I wanted to center myself. When I work with someone, I want to be completely present, completely focused on their needs. That requires clearing my mind of everything else." She approached his wheelchair, and Rashid noticed that her movements seemed deliberately calm, almost meditative. "Before we begin any physical work, I need to understand your pain completely, not just where it hurts, but how it feels, what makes it better or worse, what fears you have about it. Pain isn't just a physical sensation, it carries emotional and psychological components that can either help or hinder recovery." Rashid shifted uncomfortably in his wheelchair. "The doctors have already documented everything. I have comprehensive medical reports." "Medical reports tell me about your injuries," Zara interrupted gently. "They don't tell me about you. How has this pain changed the way you sleep? How does it affect your thoughts when you wake up in the morning? What does it make you afraid of?" The questions caught him off guard. In all his consultations with specialists, no one had asked about his fears or his thoughts. They had focused on bone density, muscle atrophy, range of motion metrics. No one had asked how the constant ache in his spine made him wake up each morning feeling like a stranger in his own body. "I don't understand why that's relevant," he said finally. Zara pulled a low stool near his wheelchair and sat down, bringing herself to his eye level. "Let me tell you about a patient I worked with in Somalia. His name was Ahmed, and he had lost his leg to a landmine. Physically, he was healing well. His residual limb was strong, his prosthetic fit properly, his balance was improving. But he couldn't walk more than a few steps before stopping." She paused, her eyes studying Rashid's face. Everyone focused on his physical therapy, his prosthetic adjustments, his muscle strength. But Ahmed wasn't stopping because of physical limitations. He was stopping because every step reminded him of the moment the mine exploded, the moment he lost not just his leg, but his sense of safety in the world. Until we address that fear, that emotional wound, his physical recovery was impossible. Rashid found himself listening more intently than he had expected. "What did you do?" "We talked. We explored not just what his body had lost, but what his identity had lost. Ahmed had been a footballer, a runner, someone who defined himself through physical movement. The mine had taken more than his leg. It had taken his sense of who he was. Once we acknowledged that grief, once we worked through it together, his physical recovery accelerated dramatically. She leaned forward slightly. Your injuries weren't caused by a landmine, Mr. Al-Qadri, but trauma is trauma. Your body isn't just healing from broken bones and torn muscles. It's healing from the shock of discovering that you're not invulnerable, that despite all your success, all your control, you're human. And that can be the most difficult injury of all to recover from. For a long moment, the room was silent, except for the gentle sound of the water fountain. Rashid stared at this woman, who had been in his home for 3 days, and somehow seemed to see straight through defenses he had spent decades constructing. "How do we begin?" he asked quietly. Zara smiled, and her entire face seemed to light up. "We begin with trust. I'm going to touch your shoulder now, and I want you to tell me exactly what you feel. Not just pain or pressure, but everything. Sometimes the body holds memories that the mind has forgotten." She moved behind his wheelchair and placed her hands gently on his damaged shoulder. Her touch was warm, confident, but surprisingly gentle. Rashid had expected clinical manipulation, the kind of aggressive physical therapy he had experienced in the hospital. Instead, her hands seemed to listen to his body, exploring the tension and damage with an almost intuitive understanding. "There's significant muscle guarding here," she said softly, her fingers tracing patterns across his shoulder blade. "Your body is protecting the injury, but it's also protecting against something else. Tell me, when did you first hurt this shoulder?" "In the car accident," Rashid replied automatically. 6 weeks ago." "No," Zara said, her hands continuing their gentle exploration. "This pattern of tension, this particular way your muscles are holding, this isn't from 6 weeks ago. This is older, much older. When did you first injure this shoulder, Mr. Al-Qadri?" Rashid's breath caught. Her hands had found something, a deep ache that seemed to pulse not just with recent trauma, but with something ancient and buried. I don't remember any other injury." Zara's fingers pressed slightly deeper, finding a knot of tension just beneath his shoulder blade. "Sometimes our bodies remember things our minds prefer to forget. Breathe with me. In slowly, and out slowly. Let your shoulder soften under my hands." As Rashid followed her breathing instructions, something strange happened. The sharp, recent pain from his car accident seemed to separate from a deeper, older ache that he hadn't even realized was there, and with that older pain came a flash of memory so unexpected it made him gasp. He was 8 years old, falling from a tree in the courtyard of his childhood home in Kuwait. He could suddenly smell the jasmine flowers that had been blooming on the wall, feel the rough bark scraping his palm as he tried to catch himself, hear his own cry of pain as his shoulder struck the ground. But more than that, he could remember the face that had leaned over him as he lay crying in the dirt. A woman's face. Dark skin, kind eyes, gentle hands examining his shoulder with the same intuitive care that Zara was showing now. A woman who had spoken to him in accented Arabic, who had sung to him while she cleaned his scrapes, who had held him while he cried, not just from physical pain, but from the terror of falling, of being hurt, of discovering that even climbing his favorite tree could lead to injury and fear. "Amara," he whispered, the name escaping his lips before he could stop it. Zara's hand stilled on his shoulder. "Who is Amara?" Rashid's eyes snapped open, the memory vanishing as quickly as it had come. He was back in his therapy room, back in his wheelchair, back in the present, where he was a powerful executive recovering from a car accident, not an 8-year-old boy crying for a woman whose name he hadn't spoken in over 30 years. I don't know where that came from," he said, his voice shaky. "It was just The pain must be affecting my thinking. But Zara was studying his face with an expression that seemed to combine professional concern with something else, something that looked almost like recognition. Amara is an African name, she said carefully. It means grace in Swahili and eternal in Arabic. It's not uncommon in Nigeria, where I'm from. Was she someone who took care of you when you were young? Rashid's heart was beating faster than it should have been. The memory that had surfaced felt too vivid, too real to dismiss as a pain-induced hallucination. But it also felt dangerous, like touching a wound that had healed over but never properly cleaned. I had many people who worked in our household when I was young, he said stiffly. I don't remember specifics. Zara nodded, but her eyes remained thoughtful. Sometimes trauma therapy awakens memories that have been dormant. It's not unusual. Our bodies store experiences, and when we begin to heal, those experiences can surface unexpectedly. She resumed her gentle manipulation of his shoulder, but now her touch felt different somehow, more careful, more searching. Your body is holding a lot of tension, Mr. Al-Qadri. Not just from recent trauma, but from years of stress, years of carrying weight that perhaps wasn't entirely your own to carry. As the session continued, Rashid found himself caught between resistance and surrender. Part of him wanted to maintain the professional distance he was accustomed to treat this as a simple medical procedure. But another part of him, a part he thought he had buried decades ago, responded to Zara's gentle competence with something that felt almost like hunger. When had anyone last touched him with such care? When had anyone last asked about his fears, his pain, his dreams? His life had become so focused on control, on power, on managing others, that he had forgotten what it felt like to be seen as simply human. That's enough for today, Zara said finally, stepping back from his wheelchair. Your shoulder will be sore tonight. We've awakened muscles that have been sleeping. But this is good soreness, healing soreness. Tomorrow we'll work on your leg, and then we'll begin building strength in your core. Rashid nodded, suddenly feeling more exhausted than he had since leaving the hospital. Thank you. That was more intense than I expected. Zara smiled, that same warm expression that seemed to light up her entire face. Healing is always intense, Mr. Al-Qadri. If it's not challenging you, changing you, pushing you to grow beyond who you were before the injury, then it's not really healing. It's just treatment. As his assistant wheeled him out of the therapy room, Rashid found himself glancing back at Zara, who was now cleaning and reorganizing her equipment with the same careful attention she had shown to his shoulder. Something about her movements, about the way she handled each tool with respect and purpose, tugged at a memory he couldn't quite grasp. That night, lying in his bed staring at the ceiling, Rashid found himself thinking not about his business empire or his recovery timeline, but about a name he hadn't spoken in over 30 years. Amara, the woman who had taken care of him when he was young, who had sung to him in a language he couldn't identify, who had disappeared from his life so completely that he had convinced himself she had never existed at all. But now, with his shoulder still aching from Zara's careful touch, he found himself wondering if perhaps some disappearances were not as permanent as they seemed, and if perhaps some healers carried more than just professional skills in their gentle hands. Perhaps they carried the power to awaken not just the body, but memories that the soul had been waiting decades to reclaim. The second week of therapy brought unexpected complications. What had begun as straightforward physical rehabilitation was evolving into something far more complex, and Rashid found himself both drawn to and deeply unsettled by the process. Each morning, Zara would arrive at the therapy room at precisely 9:30, spending 30 minutes in what she called preparation, a routine that involved arranging her equipment, adjusting the lighting, and sitting in quiet meditation. Rashid had initially found this ritual irritating, a waste of valuable time that could be spent on actual treatment. But gradually he began to appreciate the sense of calm that seemed to emanate from the space after her preparation. The room felt different when Zara was ready, more peaceful, more conducive to healing. "Today we focus on your leg," Zara announced on Monday morning of the second week, her hands already warming massage oil between her palms. "But first, I want to talk about the dreams you've been having." Rashid stiffened in his wheelchair. He hadn't mentioned dreams to anyone, least of all to her. "What makes you think I've been having dreams?" Zara approached him with that same measured calm she brought to everything. "Your assistant mentioned that you've been calling out in your sleep. Names, words, in what sounds like different languages. And this morning, you have the look of someone who hasn't really rested, even though you've been in bed for 8 hours. It was true. Since their first session, Rashid's sleep had been plagued by vivid, fragmented dreams that felt more like recovered memories than typical nocturnal wanderings. Images of a large house with high ceilings and intricate tile work, a garden with olive trees and jasmine bushes, and always, the presence of a woman whose face he could never quite see clearly, but whose voice seemed to wrap around him like a protective embrace. "Dreams are irrelevant to physical therapy," he said dismissively, but his voice lacked conviction. Zara began working on his leg, her hands finding and addressing knots of tension with that same intuitive precision she had shown with his shoulder. In Western medicine, perhaps. But in traditional healing practices, African, Asian, indigenous American, dreams are considered vital information about the healing process. They tell us what the subconscious is ready to release, what memories are surfacing to be integrated. Her fingers worked along his calf muscle, finding spots of tension he hadn't even realized were there. In my grandmother's village in Nigeria, healers would always ask about dreams before beginning treatment. They believed that the body could only heal completely when the spirit was also healing. Rashid found himself relaxing despite his resistance to the conversation. There was something about Zara's touch, confident but never invasive, strong but infinitely gentle, that seemed to bypass his conscious defenses. "Tell me about one dream," she said softly, her hands now working on his ankle and foot, just one image that keeps returning. For a moment Rashid considered refusing, but the combination of her therapeutic touch and her genuine, non-judgmental interest created a space that felt safe for vulnerability, something he hadn't experienced in years. "There's a garden," he said slowly. "Always the same garden. High, walls covered with jasmine vines, a fountain in the center with blue and white tiles. And there's singing, someone singing in a language I don't recognize, but somehow understand." Zara's hands paused for just a moment, so briefly that he might have imagined it. "What kind of song?" "Lullabies, I think. Or work songs. Something rhythmic and soothing. And there are hands, gentle hands that smell like lavender and something else, something sweet and spicy." "Shea butter," Zara said quietly, "mixed with frankincense oil. It's a traditional combination used for healing and protection." Rashid's eyes snapped open. "How could you possibly know that?" Zara continued her work on his leg, but her expression had grown thoughtful. "Because it's a very specific combination, used primarily in certain regions of West Africa. My grandmother used the same mixture when she worked as a traditional healer. It's not something you would encounter unless someone with that specific knowledge had cared for you." A chill ran down Rashid's spine. "That's impossible. I grew up in Kuwait. My family had domestic staff, yes, but they were all local. Palestinians, Syrians, some Filipinos, no Africans. Are you certain?" Zara's voice was gentle but persistent. Sometimes families don't speak openly about all the people who contribute to a household, especially if those people come from backgrounds that might be socially complicated. Rashid was about to respond with certainty, but the words died in his throat. The truth was, his memories of early childhood were surprisingly fragmented. He remembered his parents, his siblings, the grand events and important visitors. But the day-to-day details, the people who had actually cared for him moment by moment, those memories were hazy, incomplete. "My parents died 10 years ago," he said slowly. "My older siblings live in London and rarely speak of the past. There's no one left who would remember the household staff from 35 years ago." Zara finished working on his leg and moved to position herself in front of his wheelchair. "Rashid," she said, using his first name for the first time, "I want to try something different today. I want to work with your hands." She pulled a small stool in front of him and reached for his, hands turning them palm up. Hands hold memory differently than other parts of the body. They remember textures, temperatures, the feeling of being held. Sometimes they can help us access memories that the mind has locked away. Her touch was different now, less clinical, more personal. She began massaging each finger, each joint, working from his fingertips toward his wrists with a patience that seemed endless. "Close your eyes," she instructed softly. "Don't think. Just feel. Let your hands remember." At first, there was nothing but the pleasant sensation of her skilled massage, but gradually, as she worked, other sensations began to surface. The memory of different hands holding his, larger hands, with rougher skin but infinite gentleness. Hands that had taught him to roll dough, to braid rope, to shape clay into small animals. "There was someone," he whispered, his eyes still closed. "Someone who taught me things, how to make patterns with colored sand, how to whistle like a bird, how to count in another language." "What language?" Zara's voice was barely audible. Images flashed through his mind, sitting cross-legged on a rug, while gentle hands guided his fingers in forming shapes he couldn't name. A woman's voice counting "Oja abuo ato ano ise 1, 2, 3, 4, 5," he said aloud, and then stopped, startled. "I don't know what language that is. I don't know how I know those words." Zara's hands had gone completely still. When Rashid opened his eyes, her face had gone pale, her expression a mixture of shock and something that looked almost like fear. "Those numbers," she said carefully, "they're Igbo, a Nigerian language, specifically the dialect spoken in the southeastern regions." The room seemed to shift around them. Rashid stared at Zara, questions forming that he wasn't sure he wanted answered. "That's where you're from," he said slowly. "Southeastern Nigeria." Zara nodded, but her expression remained guarded. "Rashid, I need to ask you something, and I need you to think very carefully before you answer. This woman who cared for you, do you remember anything else about her? Her appearance, her age, anything she might have told you about her family?" The questions felt loaded with significance he couldn't understand. "Why? What does it matter?" "Because," Zara said, her voice trembling slightly, 34 years ago, my mother disappeared while working abroad. She had taken a position with a wealthy family in the Gulf region, a job that was supposed to last 2 years and provide enough money to build a school in our village. She sent letters for the first 6 months, and then nothing. We never heard from her again." Rashid's world seemed to tilt on its axis. "What was your mother's name?" Zara met his eyes, and he could see years of pain and unanswered questions reflected there. "Amara. Her name was Zara Okafor." The therapy room fell silent except for the gentle sound of the water fountain and the hammering of Rashid's heart. The name that had surfaced during their first session, the name he had spoken without conscious memory, now hung between them like a bridge across decades of separation and loss. "That's impossible," he whispered, But even as he said it, fragments of memory were coalescing into something more substantial. A woman who sang in multiple languages, who told stories about a daughter she had left behind, a brilliant girl who would grow up to help people, to heal them, who showed him photographs of a child with serious eyes and a determined smile. She used to show me pictures, he said, his voice growing stronger as the memories clarified. A little girl in a white school uniform. She said her daughter was going to be a doctor someday, going to help people who couldn't help themselves. Zara's eyes filled with tears. I wanted to be a doctor. But when she disappeared, when the money stopped coming, I had to change my path. Physiotherapy was more affordable, and it still let me help people. They stared at each other across the gulf of years and circumstances. Two people whose lives had been shaped by a woman's disappearance, now brought together by forces that seemed too complex to be mere coincidence. What happened to her? Rashid asked quietly. What happened to Amara? Zara wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. We never found out. The employment agency said the family claimed she had left without notice, but they refused to provide details. No forwarding address, no final payment, no explanation. She just vanished. Rashid felt a weight settling in his chest, not the physical pain of his injuries, but something deeper and more difficult to define. I remember when she left, he said slowly. There was shouting. My parents arguing with someone, though I don't know who, and then one morning she was just gone. No goodbye, no explanation. I asked about her, but my mother said she had returned to her family and that I shouldn't worry about servants. Servants, Zara repeated, her voice flat. Is that how your family saw her? Rashid looked down at his hands, the hands that Amara had taught to count in Igbo, to shape clay, to find comfort in creative work rather than just achievement. I was 8 years old. I didn't understand the dynamics, the politics. I just knew that someone who had been kind to me, who had made me feel safe, was suddenly gone. He looked up at Zara, seeing not just his physiotherapist, but the daughter of a woman who had shaped his childhood in ways he was only beginning to understand. She talked about you constantly, he said, about how proud she was, how you were going to change the world. She said you had inherited her gift for healing, but that you would have opportunities she never had. Zara's composure finally cracked, and tears began flowing freely. She never got to see me graduate, never got to know that I did become a healer, that I did find ways to help people. She disappeared believing she had failed, that she couldn't provide for my education. Rashid reached out instinctively, taking her hands in his, a gesture that felt both natural and revolutionary. For the first time in decades, he was offering comfort rather than demanding it. She didn't fail, he said firmly. She helped raise me, shaped who I became. And now, through some miracle I don't understand, her daughter is here helping me heal. That's not failure, that's legacy. As they sat together in the therapy room, holding hands across the weight of years and loss, both understood that their relationship had fundamentally changed. They were no longer simply patient and therapist. They were two people connected by love and loss, by a woman whose influence had shaped them both in ways they were only beginning to comprehend. But questions remained, terrible, urgent questions about what had really happened to Zara Okafor, and whether the truth about her disappearance was something that could still be uncovered after 34 years of silence. The revelation about Amara's identity transformed everything between Rashid and Zara, but it also created an urgent need for answers that neither of them possessed. For 3 days after their emotional discovery, they moved through the motions of physical therapy, while both their minds wrestled with questions that seemed impossible to answer after 34 years of silence. It was Zara who finally broke the careful, professional distance they had been trying to maintain. On Thursday morning, instead of beginning their usual session, She arrived at the therapy room, carrying a weathered leather satchel and wearing an expression of determined resolve. "We need to talk," she said, setting the satchel on the small table beside his wheelchair. Not as patient and therapist, but as two people who both loved the same woman and need to understand what happened to her. Rashid had been dreading and anticipating this conversation in equal measure. "What do you propose we do? It's been over 3 decades. Everyone who might have known anything is either dead or scattered across the world." Zara opened the satchel and withdrew a collection of items that immediately captured Rashid's attention. Faded photographs, yellowed letters written in careful English script, and what appeared to be official documents bearing various governmental seals. "I've spent the last 3 nights going through everything I have left of my mother," she said, spreading the materials carefully on the table. Letters she sent during those first 6 months, photographs she included, copies of her employment, documents. "I've been looking for clues we might have missed, details that could help us understand what really happened." She picked up one of the photographs, a small, slightly blurred image that showed a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile standing in front of an ornate doorway. This was the last photo she sent. "Look at the background." Rashid leaned forward, studying the image carefully. The doorway behind Amara featured distinctive carved details and inlaid patterns that seemed familiar, though he couldn't immediately place them. "I know that entrance," he said slowly. "It's our family's old house in Kuwait City, the one we lived in until I was 12. He paused, memories flooding back. "We moved after my father's business expanded, and he wanted something more modern. The old house was sold to developers." Zara pulled out one of the letters, written in Amara's careful handwriting. In this letter, dated March 15, 1990, she writes about teaching the youngest son of her employers to count in Igbo. She says he's very bright but seems lonely, that his parents are often away on business, and his older siblings don't pay much attention to him. The description hit Rashid like a physical blow. He had been 8 years old in March 1990, and lonely was certainly an accurate description. His parents had been building their petroleum empire, traveling constantly, and his older brother and sister, already teenagers, had been more interested in their own social lives than in entertaining a much younger sibling. "What else does she say?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Zara continued reading. She writes, "Little Rashid reminds me so much of my Zara. They have the same curiosity, the same way of listening, as if they're absorbing everything for future use. I find myself telling him the same stories I would tell her, teaching him the same songs. Sometimes I worry that I'm becoming too attached, but he seems to need the attention his family doesn't provide." Rashid's eyes filled with unexpected tears. He had no memory of seeming needy or lonely to Amara. In his recollection, their time together had simply been natural, comfortable, filled with learning and gentle care. To discover that she had seen his emotional needs so clearly and had consciously tried to fill them added a new dimension to his understanding of their relationship. "There's more," Zara said, pulling out another letter. "This one is from April, and the tone is different. Listen to this. I'm worried about the family dynamics here. There are tensions I don't fully understand. Discussions in Arabic that stop when I enter a room. Yesterday, Mrs. Al-Qadri asked me detailed questions about my family back home, about whether I had plans to return to Nigeria permanently. When I mentioned my hopes of saving enough money to fund Zara's university education, she seemed displeased. I can't shake the feeling that something is changing." Rashid frowned, trying to access memories of his mother's attitude toward Amara. His recollections of that period were filtered through an 8-year-old's perspective, but he could recall a growing tension in the household that he hadn't understood at the time. "My mother was traditional," he said carefully. "She believed in clear social hierarchies, proper boundaries between family and staff. If she sensed that I was becoming too attached to Amara, or that Amara was influencing me in ways she didn't approve of. He trailed off, but Zara nodded grimly. The last letter we received was dated June 3rd, 1990. In it, she mentions that the family is planning a move to a new house and that there's been discussion about restructuring the household staff. She seemed nervous but tried to sound optimistic, saying she hoped the changes would mean more stability. Zara set down the letter and picked up an official-looking document. This is a copy of her employment contract, arranged through an agency in Lagos. According to this, she was guaranteed 2 years of employment with the possibility of extension, plus return transportation to Nigeria and a completion bonus equivalent to 6 months' salary. But she never received any of that, Rashid said, understanding beginning to dawn. When we moved to the new house, I remember being told that several staff members had chosen not to continue with the family. It was presented as their decision, as if they had found better opportunities or wanted to return to their home countries. Zara's expression hardened. According to the employment agency's records, which I finally managed to access last year through a lawyer in Lagos, your family claimed that my mother had abandoned her position without notice, forfeiting her right to completion pay or return transportation. They said she had simply disappeared one night, leaving behind a note saying she was returning to Nigeria. Immediately. That doesn't sound like the woman I remember, Rashid said immediately. Amara was responsible, caring. She wouldn't have left without saying goodbye, especially not to me. He paused, struggling to find words for a relationship that had been central to his childhood, but impossible to categorize. We meant something to each other. Zara reached into the satchel again and withdrew a small, carved wooden elephant. Clearly, African in origin, worn smooth by years of handling. Do you remember this? Rashid's breath caught. He did remember it, not just the elephant, but the story that went with it. She told me it was made by her father, carved from a tree that grew near their village. She said elephants represented memory, that they never forgot the people they loved, no matter how far apart they were separated. She promised to give it to me when she returned, Zara said softly. This elephant was supposed to be proof that she hadn't forgotten me, that everything she was doing was for our future together. Instead, it's one of the only things of hers that I have left. Rashid stared at the small carving, memories flooding back with startling clarity. He could remember Amara letting him hold the elephant while she told him stories, the weight of it in his small hands, the way she would smile when he traced its carved features with his finger. Zara, he said slowly, I need to make some phone calls. There are people who might still have information, lawyers who handled the house sale, accountants who managed household finances, maybe even some of the other staff members who worked for my family during that period. After 34 years, Zara's voice was skeptical but hopeful. You'd be surprised how long business records are kept, especially for families with significant assets. And in Kuwait, the expatriate community is smaller than you might think. People remember things, particularly unusual events or sudden departures. Rashid pulled out his phone and began scrolling through contacts, his mind racing through possibilities. My family's business manager during that period was a man named Hassan Al-Shammari. He's in his 70s now, but still sharp. If anyone would remember details about household staff changes, it would be him. As Rashid began making calls, Zara continued examining her mother's letters and documents. The formal therapy session had been completely abandoned, replaced by a joint investigation that felt both urgent and deeply personal. The first few calls yielded little useful information. Former business associates expressed sympathy but claimed no specific memory of household staff from the early 1990s. But when Rashid reached Hassan Al-Shammari, the older man's response was immediately different. "Rashid, my boy," Hassan said, his voice warm with genuine affection. I was wondering when you might call about this subject. I've been expecting it for years." Expecting it? Rashid put the call on speaker so Zara could hear. "What do you mean?" There was a long pause before Hassan responded. "The African woman who cared for you, Amara, your mother asked me to handle certain arrangements regarding her departure. I've carried the weight of that knowledge for over 3 decades, hoping someday there would be an opportunity to address it properly." Zara leaned forward, her hands gripping the arms of her chair. "What arrangements?" Hassan's voice became careful, measured. "Before I continue, I need to know, why are you asking about this now? What has prompted this inquiry after so many years?" Rashid glanced at Zara, seeing his own determination reflected in her eyes. "Hassan, I'm going to tell you something that will sound impossible. The woman asking about Amara is her daughter. Zara has been working as my physiotherapist, and through pure coincidence, or perhaps something more than coincidence, we've discovered our connection." The silence on the phone stretched so long that Rashid wondered if the call had been dropped. Finally, Hassan spoke, his voice thick with emotion. "Dear God, after all these years..." "Rashid, what I'm about to tell you may be difficult to hear. Your mother didn't approve of Amara's influence on you. She felt that you were becoming too attached, too influenced by what she called inappropriate cultural exposure. When the family decided to move houses, your mother saw it as an opportunity to restructure the household in a way that would be more appropriate to your family's rising social status." "What does that mean exactly?" Zara's voice was steady, but Rashid could see the tension in her posture. "It means," Hassan said heavily, "that Amara was given an ultimatum. She could accept immediate termination with a basic severance package or face deportation proceedings based on trumped-up allegations of theft. Your mother had already spoken to immigration officials, claiming that items had gone missing from the household." Rashid felt sick. "Theft? Amara would never—" "Of course she wouldn't," Hassan interrupted. "Everyone who worked with her knew she was completely honest. But your mother had influence, connections. The threat was real, and Amara had no resources to fight it. She was told that if she left quietly and immediately, the allegations would be dropped and she would receive enough money to return to Nigeria. But she never made it home," Zara said, her voice breaking. "We never heard from her again after June 1990. Another long pause. When Hassan spoke again, his voice was barely audible. "I arranged for her transportation to the airport and gave her the settlement money personally. She was supposed to fly to Lagos the next morning, but Rashid..." "The flight. Records show she never boarded that plane. She disappeared somewhere between leaving your family's house and reaching the airport, and I've been haunted by that knowledge ever since." The therapy room fell silent, except for the sound of Zara's quiet crying and the rapid beating of Rashid's heart. After 34 years, they finally had part of the truth, but it was a truth that opened darker possibilities than either of them had anticipated. "Hassan," Rashid said finally, "I need you to tell me everything you remember about that night. Every detail, no matter how small. Because Zara deserves to know what happened to her mother, and I need to understand how my family was involved in whatever occurred." As Hassan began to recount the events of that night in June 1990, both Rashid and Zara understood that their search for answers was about to lead them into territory that might be more dangerous and painful than either of them was prepared to face. Hassan al-Shamari's voice grew heavy with the weight of decades-old guilt as he began recounting the events of June 15, 1990, a night that had haunted him for over 30 years. "I arrived at your family's house around 9 in the evening," Hassan said, his words coming slowly, deliberately. "Your mother had called me that afternoon, saying there was an urgent matter that needed to be handled with complete discretion. When I arrived, Amara was waiting in the servants' quarters with 2 small suitcases, everything she owned in the world. Zara clutched her mother's photograph, her knuckles white with tension. What was her state of mind? Was she frightened? Dignified but devastated, Hassan replied without hesitation. She kept asking if there was any way to speak with young Rashid before leaving, to explain why she had to go. Your mother had forbidden any contact, said it would be inappropriate and disruptive. Amara was crying, not hysterically, but with the quiet grief of someone whose heart was breaking. Rashid closed his eyes, imagining his 8-year-old self, sleeping peacefully, while the woman who had become like a second mother was being forced from his life without explanation. What exactly did my mother tell her? That items of significant value had been discovered missing from the household. Jewelry, cash, some of your father's business documents. Your mother claimed she had no choice but to report the thefts to immigration authorities unless Amara agreed to immediate termination and departure. Hassan paused, his breathing audible over the phone. But Rashid, I had helped your mother inventory those very items just weeks earlier when she was preparing for the move to the new house. Nothing was missing. The allegations were completely fabricated. Zara's voice was tight with controlled fury, so she was coerced into leaving under threat of criminal prosecution for crimes she didn't commit. Worse than that, Hassan continued, your mother made it clear that if Amara ever attempted to contact the family again, or if she tried to dispute the allegations publicly, the immigration authorities would be notified immediately. She would be barred from ever entering Kuwait again, and the criminal allegations would be shared with Nigerian authorities. Rashid felt a sick knot forming in his stomach as he understood the full scope of his mother's calculated cruelty. She was ensuring Amara's permanent silence. I gave Amara an envelope containing her settlement money, 3,000 Kuwaiti dinars, which was substantial at the time, and arranged for a taxi to take her to Kuwait International Airport. Her flight to Lagos was scheduled for 6:30 the Next morning, I told her to check into the airport hotel for the night, to stay safe and get some rest before the journey. Hassan's voice became strained. The last thing she said to me was, please tell Rashid that I loved him like my own son, and that everything I taught him about kindness and courage was meant to help him become a good man. Then she got into the taxi, and I watched it drive away. Zara was openly crying now, but her voice remained steady. What time did the taxi leave the house? Just before 10:30 p.m. The drive to the airport should have taken no more than 45 minutes. At that hour, she had plenty of time to check in, get settled and catch her flight the next morning. But she never boarded the plane, Rashid said grimly. No, I checked with the airline the following week when your mother asked me to confirm Amara's departure. The flight record showed she never checked in. Her seat remained empty. Zara leaned forward intently. Did you contact the taxi company? The police? Anyone? Hassan's response came after a long, painful pause. Your mother forbade any investigation. She said that if Amara had chosen not to board her flight, that was her decision, and the family had fulfilled their obligations by providing transportation and settlement money. She insisted that any further inquiry would only draw unwanted attention to the family during a sensitive business period. And you accepted that? Zara's voice was sharp with accusation. I was a young man, completely dependent on your family's business for my livelihood, Hassan replied defensively. I had a wife and 2 small children. I convinced myself that Amara had perhaps decided to stay in Kuwait, maybe found other work, but as the years passed, and especially after I heard nothing more about her, I began to understand that something terrible had likely happened. Rashid's mind was racing through possibilities, each more disturbing than the last. Hassan, do you remember the name of the taxi company? The driver? Any details that might help us track what happened that night? I used Al Salam Transportation. They Handled most airport runs for expatriate families at the time. The driver was a Pakistani man named Mahmood. I don't remember his last name, but he was one of their regular drivers for late-night airport transfers. Zara grabbed a notebook and began writing frantically. Al-Salam Transportation, Pakistani driver named Mahmood, June 15th, 1990, approximately 10:30 p.m. departure. Zara, Hassan said, his voice suddenly urgent, there's something else you need to know. 2 weeks after Amara's disappearance, I received a visit from a Kuwaiti police detective. He was asking questions about a woman's body that had been found in the desert outside the city, an African woman, approximately the right age, and physical description. The therapy room fell completely silent. Rashid felt his blood turn to ice. The body had been there for some time, Hassan continued reluctantly. The detective said identification was difficult, but they were trying to trace any African women who had gone missing recently. I should have told him about Amara, should have provided her information, but I was terrified of contradicting your mother's story, terrified of the consequences for my own family. Zara's notebook fell from her trembling hands. You think my mother was murdered? I don't know, Hassan said, his voice breaking, but I've lived with the guilt of my silence for 34 years. If I had spoken up then, if I had insisted on a proper investigation. Rashid's hands were shaking as he reached for Zara's notebook, writing down every detail Hassan had provided. Hassan, I need you to tell me everything you remember about that police visit, the detective's name, what specific questions he asked, any details about the body they found. The detective's name was Sergeant Khalil al-Rashid. I remember because he shared your family name, though no relation. He showed me a photograph. Hassan's voice trailed off. What kind of photograph? Zara demanded. Jewelry, a small pendant necklace that had been found with the body. He was asking if I recognized it, if any of the household staff in expatriate families might have owned something like it. Zara gasped and reached into her mother's satchel, pulling out a small jewelry box. With trembling fingers, she opened it to reveal a matching chain, clearly part of a set. My mother wore a pendant every day, she whispered. It was a gift from my grandmother, a traditional Igbo protection symbol. She never took it off. But when we received her personal effects from the employment agency, the few things they claimed she had left behind, the pendant wasn't among them. Rashid studied the chain in Zara's hands, his mind working through the implications. Hassan, what happened to that police investigation? Why wasn't it pursued? Another long pause. Within a few days of the detective's visit to me, the investigation was quietly closed. Word came down from higher authorities that the case was being transferred to immigration officials, that it involved undocumented workers and was no longer a police matter. Sergeant Al-Rashid was reassigned to a different department. The pieces were forming a picture that none of them wanted to acknowledge. A woman threatened with false criminal charges, forced to leave under cover of darkness, then disappearing between her point of departure and safety. A convenient investigation that was quickly shut down. A family with enough influence to control both the narrative and the official response. Hassan, Rashid said finally, I need you to help us find Sergeant Al-Rashid. If he's still alive, if he still has any records or memories from that investigation, we need to speak with him. Rashid, I understand your desire for answers, but you must be careful. Your mother may be gone, but the people who helped her protect the family's reputation, some of them are still very much alive and still very powerful. Zara looked up from her mother's jewelry box, her eyes blazing with determination. I don't care how powerful they are. My mother deserves justice, and I deserve the truth about what happened to her. Hassan's voice carried a note of admiration, mixed with concern. Very well. I'll make some inquiries about Al-Rashid, but promise me you'll be cautious. If your mother was indeed murdered to protect your family's secrets, then anyone who gets too close to the truth may be putting themselves in danger. After the call ended, Rashid and Zara sat in stunned silence, surrounded by the evidence of a crime that had been covered up for over 3 decades. The therapy room, which had begun as a place of healing, had become the center of an investigation that would either provide the closure Zara desperately needed or destroy whatever peace either of them had managed to find. "We have to keep going," Zara said finally, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. "Whatever the risks, whatever the consequences, I need to know what happened to her." Rashid reached over and took her hands in his, hands that had learned to count in Igbo from the woman they were now seeking to vindicate. "Then we keep going, together, no matter where it leads us." As the afternoon sun slanted through the therapy room windows, casting long shadows across Amara's letters and photographs, both Rashid and Zara understood that their search for truth had become something more than an investigation. It had become a quest for justice that would either heal the wounds of the past or tear open new ones that might never close. But for the first time since beginning this journey, they also understood that they weren't facing it alone. In finding each other, in discovering their shared connection to Amara, they had found the strength to confront whatever darkness lay ahead. The woman who had disappeared 34 years ago had somehow managed to bring them together at exactly the moment when they would need each other most. The next phase of their investigation would require them to leave the safety of Rashid's compound and venture into a world where powerful people had once killed to protect their secrets and might be willing to kill again. The decision to actively pursue the investigation marked a turning point that neither Rashid nor Zara could now have anticipated when their professional relationship began just 3 weeks earlier. What had started as physical rehabilitation had evolved into something far more complex, a mission that would require them to challenge not just the official narrative of Amara's disappearance, but the very foundations of Rashid's family legacy. Hassan's promise to locate former Sergeant Khalil al-Rashid proved more challenging than expected. 2 days of careful inquiries through his network of contacts revealed that al-Rashid had retired from the police force in 1995, citing health reasons that colleagues suspected were more political than medical. He had subsequently worked as a private security consultant for various businesses before seemingly vanishing from public life entirely around 2010. "It's as if he deliberately made himself difficult to find," Hassan reported during their second phone conversation. "But I may have a lead." A former colleague mentioned that al-Rashid had family in the Hawali district. "I'm working on getting a current address." While Hassan pursued that lead, Rashid made a decision that surprised even himself. For the first time since his accident, he insisted on leaving his compound, not for a medical appointment or business meeting, but to visit the Kuwait National Archives. "You're not physically ready for this kind of excursion," Zara protested, as she helped him transfer from his wheelchair to the passenger seat of his modified vehicle. "Your therapy schedule can be adjusted," Rashid interrupted firmly. "Zara, my body will heal regardless, but if we don't pursue this investigation while the trail is still warm, we may never get another chance." The Archives building, a modern structure in Kuwait City's government district, presented its own challenges for someone in Rashid's condition, but his determination was absolute, and his family name still carried enough weight to ensure accommodating assistance from the staff. The records they sought were classified under multiple bureaucratic categories: police files, immigration documents, and judicial proceedings from 1990. Access required special permissions that would normally take weeks to obtain. However, Rashid's business empire had maintained relationships with various government officials for decades, and within hours they found themselves seated in a private research room with boxes of files spread across a conference table. "This feels surreal," Zara murmured as she opened the first box. 34 years later, finally getting to see what the authorities knew about my mother's disappearance. The immigration files proved most revealing. Amara's work visa, employment, authorization, and residential registration were all meticulously documented. But the final entry in her file was a single sheet, dated June 20th, 1990, 5 days after her disappearance, stating that she had voluntarily terminated employment and departed Kuwait for personal reasons. "Voluntary termination," Rashid read aloud, his voice bitter. 5 days after she supposedly left, when no one had heard from her. How could they have known her departure was voluntary? Zara was examining immigration departure records. According to this, she was officially processed as having left Kuwait on June 16th via Kuwait Airways Flight 412 to Lagos. But Hassan already confirmed she never boarded that flight. "Someone falsified the departure records," Rashid concluded, "which means this cover-up involved immigration officials, not just my family." The police files proved even more disturbing. The case file for the unidentified woman found in the desert was surprisingly thin, barely 10 pages of documentation for what should have been a complex investigation. The body had been discovered by Bedouin herders on June 28th. Approximately 20 kilometers southeast of Kuwait City, in an area known for its remoteness and difficult access. The medical examiner's preliminary report was clinical but devastating. Female, approximately 30-35 years of age, African descent, deceased approximately 10-14 days based on decomposition. Cause of death, blunt force trauma to the head consistent with assault. Evidence of defensive wounds suggests victim attempted to resist attack. Zara's hands trembled as she read the medical details, but her voice remained steady. "She fought. Back. My mother fought back." Rashid continued reading from the investigative notes. Personal effects recovered. Gold pendant necklace with traditional African symbols. No identification documents. No currency or valuables. Clothing consistent with domestic worker attire? "The pendant," Zara whispered, reaching into her purse to touch the matching chain she now carried everywhere. It was definitely her. But the most shocking discovery came in the file's final pages. A series of interdepartmental memos documenting the investigation's abrupt termination. The language was bureaucratic, but clear. Case transferred to Immigration Authority per directive from Ministry of Interior. No further police investigation required. File to be sealed pending administrative review. The memo was signed by Police Captain Ahmed Al-Mansouri and dated July 2nd, 1990, barely 4 days after the body's discovery. "They shut down the investigation almost immediately," Rashid said, his voice filled with growing anger. "A woman was murdered, and they closed the case before any real investigation could begin." Zara was studying the signature on the memo. Al-Mansouri. That name seems familiar somehow. Rashid's blood turned cold as the significance hit him. Ahmed Al-Mansouri wasn't just any police captain in 1990. He's currently Kuwait's Deputy Minister of Interior, one of the most powerful law enforcement officials in the country. The implications were staggering. The man who had shut down Amara's murder investigation was now in a position to control virtually any attempt to reopen it. If Al-Mansouri had been involved in the original cover-up, then their investigation had already attracted the attention of someone with the power to destroy them. "We need to leave," Rashid said urgently, beginning to gather the files. "Now." But as they prepared to exit the archives, a young clerk approached their table with an apologetic expression. "Excuse me, Mr. Al-Qadri. I've been instructed to inform you that these files have been recalled for administrative review. I'll need to collect all materials immediately." Rashid's suspicions crystallized into certainty. Someone had been monitoring their research, and powerful forces were already moving to contain their investigation. "Of course," he said calmly, handing over the files while discreetly palming several key documents. "We appreciate the assistance." As they left the archives building, Rashid's mind was racing through the implications of what they had discovered. The cover-up hadn't been a spontaneous decision by his family. It had been a coordinated effort involving multiple government agencies and officials who were still in positions of power. "Where do we go from here?" Zara asked, as they sat in his vehicle outside the archives. "If Deputy Minister Al-Mansouri is involved, then pursuing this investigation officially could be suicide." Rashid started the engine, his decision crystallizing. "Then we don't pursue it officially." Hassan texted while we were inside. He found Al-Rashid. The former sergeant lives in a small apartment in Hawali and works part-time as a security guard for a shopping center. "We're going to visit him tonight." "Rashid, if Al-Mansouri is monitoring our activities, then he already knows we're investigating, and trying to stop now won't protect us," Rashid interrupted. "Our only safety lies in uncovering the complete truth and making it public. Once the story is out, it becomes more dangerous to silence us than to let us live." That evening, they drove through the crowded streets of Hawali district, a middle-class neighborhood far removed from the luxury of Rashid's compound. Finding former Sergeant Khalil al-Rashid proved surprisingly easy. Hassan's information was accurate, and they located him working the evening shift at a small shopping center's security desk. Al-Rashid was a man in his late 60s, grey-haired and lean, with the alert bearing of someone who had spent decades in law enforcement. When Rashid introduced himself and mentioned their interest in a 1990 case involving an unidentified African woman, Al-Rashid's reaction was immediate and dramatic. "You shouldn't be here," he said quietly, glancing around the shopping center's atrium. Asking about that case destroyed my career and nearly got me killed." Zara leaned forward intently. "The woman who was murdered, her name was Zara Okafor. She was my mother." Al-Rashid's composure cracked. He stared at Zara for a long moment, then made a decision that would change everything. "Come with me," he said, leading them to a small office behind the security desk. "There are things you need to know, things I've been carrying for 34 years. But first, you need to understand the danger you're in by pursuing this." He locked the office door and pulled down the window blinds before speaking again. "Your mother's murder wasn't random, and it wasn't a robbery gone wrong. She was killed because she knew something that powerful people couldn't allow her to reveal." "What kind of something?" Rashid asked. Al-Rashid opened a desk drawer and withdrew a folder that looked like it had been hidden there for decades. "In 1990, your family wasn't just building a petroleum business, Mr. Al-Qadri. They were laundering money for some very dangerous people, arms dealers, drug traffickers, government officials taking bribes from foreign interests." Zara gasped. "You're saying my mother discovered this?" "I'm saying your mother saw financial documents that she shouldn't have seen, overheard conversations that she wasn't supposed to understand. And when your family decided to silence her, they discovered she had already begun writing letters to Nigerian authorities, trying to report what she had witnessed." Al-Rashid opened the folder, revealing photocopies of documents that made Rashid's stomach turn. Financial records, transaction logs, correspondence between his father and individuals whose names were associated with international crime syndicates. "I made copies of everything before the case was shut down," Al-Rashid explained. "I knew that someday someone would come looking for answers. Your mother died trying to expose corruption that reached the highest levels of government. and the people who killed her are still very much alive and very much in power. As Rashid stared at evidence of his family's criminal activities, he understood that their investigation had led them far beyond a simple murder case. They were now confronting a conspiracy that had shaped decades of his country's political and economic landscape, a conspiracy that had claimed his surrogate mother's life and would claim theirs too if they weren't extremely careful about their next moves. The woman who had taught him to count in Igbo and shape clay animals had died because she had tried to protect the innocent from the powerful. Now, 34 years later, her daughter and the boy she had loved were faced with the same choice: remain silent and stay safe, or risk everything to ensure that her death had meaning. The documents that former Sergeant Al-Rashid spread across his cramped office desk painted a picture of corruption so vast and systematic that it redefined everything Rashid thought he knew about his family's empire. Bank transfer records from 1989 and 1990 showed millions of dollars flowing through Al-Qadri accounts from sources that had nothing to do with legitimate petroleum business. Arms manufacturers in Eastern Europe, pharmaceutical companies with known ties to illegal drug production, and most damning of all, direct payments from Iraqi government officials during the period leading up to the Gulf War. Your father wasn't just building an oil company, Al-Rashid explained, his voice heavy with decades of suppressed knowledge. He was creating a financial infrastructure for people who needed to move dirty money through respectable channels. Kuwait's banking system, the family's legitimate business operations, it was all being used as a washing machine for international crime. Zara studied a photocopied letter dated May 1990, written in her mother's careful handwriting, but addressed to the Nigerian embassy in Kuwait. She was trying to report this to authorities in her home country, she said, her voice filled with pride and grief. She knew she couldn't trust local officials, so she was reaching out to Nigeria. Rashid read over her shoulder, his heart breaking as he recognized Amara's distinctive penmanship, the same careful script that had once helped him practice his letters when he was learning to write. She writes here that she accidentally discovered financial documents during her cleaning duties, documents that she initially didn't understand but gradually realized represented something criminal. That's what got her killed, Al-Rashid said bluntly. Not the fact that she saw the documents. That could have been explained away, dismissed as the confusion of an uneducated domestic worker. But the moment she demonstrated understanding of what she had seen, the moment she began documenting it and attempting to report it, she became a threat that couldn't be contained. Al-Rashid pulled out another set of documents, police surveillance reports that Rashid didn't understand at first. These are records of phone taps and mail intercepts from your family's residence during April and May 1990. The police were already investigating your father's business activities when Amara stumbled into the middle of it. The police were investigating my father? Rashid's voice was barely a whisper. A joint task force involving Kuwaiti authorities, Interpol, and American DEA agents. Your family was suspected of laundering money for Iraqi intelligence services who were preparing for the invasion, but the investigation was called off abruptly in early June, just weeks before Amara's murder. Zara looked up from the documents. She was studying. Called off by who? Al-Rashid's expression grew grim. That's where the conspiracy reaches its highest levels. The order came directly from the Ministry of Interior, from Ahmed al-Mansouri himself, though he was just a captain then. The official explanation was that the investigation was being transferred to national security agencies for reasons of state security. But that wasn't the real reason, Rashid said, understanding beginning to dawn. The real reason was that several high-ranking government officials were also implicated in the money laundering scheme. Al-Mansouri wasn't shutting down the investigation to protect your family. He was shutting it down to protect himself and his colleagues. Al-Rashid opened his desk drawer and withdrew a small recording device that looked ancient by modern standards. I kept one piece of evidence that I've never shown to anyone. On June 14th, 1990, the day before Amara disappeared, I received a phone call from an informant who worked at your family's house, another domestic worker who was terrified about what she had witnessed. He pressed play on the device, and a woman's voice filled the small office, speaking in accented English. "Sergeant Al-Rashid, this is Fatima. I work for the Al-Qadri family. I'm calling because I'm afraid for Amara. She discovered something about the family's business, and now they are planning to send her away. But I heard Mrs. Al-Qadri on the phone tonight, speaking to someone about ensuring the problem is permanently resolved. She said the woman knows too much and cannot be allowed to reach Nigeria alive." The recording continued. "Amara does not know about this plan. She thinks she is just being deported, but Mrs. Al-Qadri has arranged something else. I am too frightened to speak openly, but someone must know the truth if something happens to her." The office fell silent as the recording ended. Zara was crying, but her tears were mixed with fury. They planned it. They planned her murder in advance. That recording would have been enough to bring down your family's entire operation. Al-Rashid told Rashid, but before I could act on it, I received visit from 3 men in expensive suits. They didn't identify themselves officially, but they made it clear that pursuing the investigation further would result in the disappearance of my own family. Rashid stared at the recording device, understanding that he was looking at evidence that could still destroy not just his family's reputation, but dozens of powerful people who had built their careers on the foundation of Amara's murder. "What happened to Fatima?" Zara asked. Al-Rashid's expression grew even more somber. "She died in a car accident 3 days after Amara's body was discovered. Single vehicle collision on a straight road in perfect weather conditions. Very convenient timing." The scope of the conspiracy was becoming clear. Not just a single murder, but multiple killings designed to eliminate every potential witness to the money laundering operation. Amara hadn't been an isolated victim. She had been the most visible casualty in a systematic elimination of anyone who threatened the network. "Why are you telling us this now?" Rashid asked. "Why risk your safety after 34 years of silence?" Al-Rashid looked directly at Zara. "Because your mother died trying to protect innocent people from criminals, and I've spent 34 years being a coward. Because every day I've remained silent, I've been complicit in her murder. And because..." He paused, his voice growing emotional. "Because I have a daughter your age, and I can't bear the thought of her living her entire life not knowing what happened to her mother." Zara reached across the desk and grasped Al-Rashid's weathered hands. "What you're doing now? Sharing this information, helping us understand the truth. It's not cowardice. It's courage." Al-Rashid gathered the documents and recordings, placing them in a manila envelope. "These copies are yours now, but you need to understand what possessing them means. The people who killed your mother are still alive, still powerful, still dangerous. Al-Mansouri has risen to become Deputy Minister of Interior. Several other officials involved in the cover-up now hold senior positions in government, banking, and business." "What do you recommend we do?" Rashid asked. "If you want to survive this, you need to make the information public quickly and dramatically. Once it's in the hands of international media, it becomes more dangerous to kill you than to let you live. But the window between possession and publication is when you're most vulnerable." Al-Rashid stood and moved to the window, checking the parking lot below. "You should also know that asking questions at the archives today has already attracted attention. I received a phone call this afternoon, someone claiming to be from the Ministry of Interior, asking about any contact I might have had with members of the Al-Qadri family." Rashid felt his blood turn cold. What did you tell them? That I was a retired security guard with no knowledge of anything beyond shopping center patrol schedules. But they know you're investigating, and they know you've made connections. You probably have 24 hours, maybe less, before they decide you're too dangerous to ignore. As they prepared to leave Al-Rashid's office, the former sergeant handed Zara a second envelope, smaller, more personal. This contains copies of the letters your mother wrote to the Nigerian embassy. She never got to send them, but I want you to know that her final words were about you. She was trying to expose the corruption not for revenge or money, but because she wanted to build a better world for her daughter. Outside in the parking lot, as they walked toward Rashid's vehicle, Zara suddenly stopped. Rashid, there's something I need to tell you. Something I discovered in my mother's letters that I haven't shared yet. She opened the smaller envelope Al-Rashid had given her and withdrew a letter dated June 10th, 1990, 5 days before Amara's disappearance. Listen to this, she said, reading by the light of a street lamp. My dearest Zara, if something happens to me, if I cannot return to you as planned, there is something you must know about the Al-Qadri family. The youngest son, Rashid, is an innocent child caught in the middle of his family's crimes. I have grown to love him as I love you, and I fear for what his future will hold when he discovers the truth about his heritage. She continued reading. If fate ever brings you into contact with Rashid Al-Qadri, remember that he carries no responsibility for his family's sins. Help him if you can, for he will need guidance to become the man his heart wants him to be, rather than the man his family's legacy would make him. Rashid stood frozen in the parking lot, overwhelmed by the realization that even in her final days, while facing threats and planning her own escape, Amara had been thinking about his future and his moral development. She knew, he whispered. Even then, she knew that someday we would need each other. As they drove through the darkened streets of Kuwait City, both understood that they had crossed a point of no return. They possessed evidence that could destroy some of the most powerful people in the country, but they also carried the weight of Amara's faith in their ability to use that evidence wisely. The woman who had died trying to protect the innocent had somehow managed to engineer her own justice through the connection between her daughter and the boy she had loved as a son. But whether that justice would come in the form of truth and redemption or in the form of joining her in death remained to be seen. The next 24 hours would determine not just their survival, but whether Zara Okafor's sacrifice would finally be vindicated after more than 3 decades of silence. The 24 hours that followed their meeting with Al-Rashid became a race against time that would test every lesson Amara had taught about courage, integrity, and the power of truth to overcome corruption. Rashid and Zara returned to his compound, knowing that powerful forces were already moving against them, but also understanding that they possessed the evidence to bring justice to a woman who had been silenced for over 3 decades. Their first decision was strategic. Rather than attempting to work through Kuwait's compromised legal system, they would take their evidence directly to international media and human rights organizations. Rashid used his business connections to arrange secure communications with journalists at The Guardian, Al Jazeera, and CNN, while Zara contacted Amnesty International and several African human rights organizations that specialized in cases involving migrant workers. We can't just send documents through email, Zara pointed out as they worked through the night in Rashid's study. If they're monitoring our communications, they'll intercept everything before it reaches its destination. Rashid had anticipated this problem. I've arranged for 3 different international courier services to pick up packages tomorrow morning. Each one will carry identical sets of evidence to different destinations. Even if they intercept 1 or 2, at least one package will reach safety. But their most important decision was personal. They would film their own testimony, creating a complete record of their investigation that could be released immediately if anything happened to them. Using professional video equipment from Rashid's business office, they spent hours recording their story. Zara speaking about her mother's life and disappearance, Rashid confronting his family's criminal legacy, and both of them presenting the evidence they had gathered. "My name is Zara Okafor," she began, looking directly into the camera with the same determined expression her mother had worn in the photographs from 1990. 34 years ago, my mother, Amara Okafor, was murdered in Kuwait for trying to expose government corruption and international money laundering. Her killers buried the truth, but they could not bury the love that would eventually bring justice. Rashid's testimony was even more powerful because of his position within the system. They were exposing, "I am Rashid Al-Qadri, son of the family whose crimes cost an innocent woman her life. I speak now not to defend my family's legacy, but to honor the memory of the woman who taught me that true strength comes from protecting the innocent, not exploiting them." As dawn approached, they received a phone call that confirmed their worst fears and their best hopes simultaneously. Hassan called to warn them that black SUVs had been observed outside his house, and that he had received threatening phone calls demanding information about their investigation. "But I also have news," Hassan continued, his voice filled with excitement despite the danger. "I contacted your sister Layla in London and told her everything. She's agreed to hold a press conference this afternoon at the Kuwait embassy, presenting the evidence and demanding an international investigation." Rashid was stunned. Layla had been only 16 when Amara disappeared, but she had always been the most moral member of their family. If she was willing to stand publicly against their parents' legacy, it would add enormous credibility to their accusations. "She remembers Amara fondly," Hassan explained, "and she said she always suspected there was more to her disappearance than your parents admitted. She's bringing her own legal team and has already contacted several human rights organizations." The final pieces of their plan fell into place with the efficiency that comes from moral certainty. At 9 a.m., 3 courier packages left Kuwait carrying evidence to London, New York, and Geneva. At 10 a.m., their video testimony was uploaded to multiple secure servers with instructions for automatic release if they failed to check in every 12 hours. At 11 a.m., Layla Al-Qadri held her press conference in London, standing before international media and announcing that her family was responsible for the murder of an innocent woman who had tried to protect children from harm. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, the story was headline news across the Middle East and Africa. International human rights organizations demanded immediate investigation. The Nigerian government formally requested that Kuwait reopen the case and extradite anyone found responsible for Amara's murder. But the most powerful response came from an unexpected source: Kuwait's own civil society. Young activists, women's rights organizations, and migrant worker advocacy groups took to social media and the streets, demanding justice for Amara and accountability for the officials who had covered up her murder. By evening, Deputy Minister Al-Mansouri had resigned from his position, claiming health reasons but fooling no one. 3 other high-ranking officials announced their retirement, and the current government, desperate to distance itself from the scandal, announced the formation of an independent commission to investigate historical cases of migrant worker abuse. Rashid and Zara watched these developments from the safety of his compound, surrounded by private security, but also by something more powerful: the protection that comes from having made the truth public. They were no longer vulnerable targets. They were international figures whose safety was being monitored by human rights organizations around the world. "She did it," Zara whispered, holding her mother's photograph as they watched news coverage of demonstrations demanding justice. After 34 years, she finally got her voice back. But their victory was more than just political or legal. Over the weeks that followed, as international investigators arrived in Kuwait and the case gained momentum, Rashid and Zara discovered that their search for justice had created something else equally valuable, a foundation for healing that neither of them had expected. Rashid's physical recovery, which had stalled during the intense period of investigation, accelerated dramatically once the emotional weight of his family's secrets had been lifted. Working with Zara was no longer about hiding from the past, but about building a future that honored the best of what Amara had taught them both. "Your shoulder mobility has improved by 40% in just 2 weeks, Zara observed during a therapy session that felt remarkably different from their early encounters. "It's as if releasing the emotional tension freed your body to heal as well." Rashid flexed his arm, marveling at the range of motion that had seemed impossible just a month earlier. Amara always said that healing had to include the whole person, body, mind, and spirit. "I think I'm finally understanding what she meant." Their relationship had evolved far beyond the professional boundaries that had initially defined it. They were partners in the truest sense, two people who had found in each other the strength to confront impossible challenges and the wisdom to transform pain into purpose. 6 months after the investigation concluded, they stood together in the garden of Rashid's compound, watching construction workers break ground for a new project, the Zara Okafor Center for Migrant Worker Rights, funded by the liquidation of Rashid's father's remaining business assets and designed to provide legal aid, healthcare, and education support for domestic workers throughout the Gulf region. "She would have loved this," Zara said, watching children from the local community play in the garden where they were planning to build educational facilities. All her life, she dreamed of creating a school that would help people build better futures. Rashid took her hand, a gesture that had become natural between them. "She did create it. She just had to wait 34 years for us to understand the blueprints." The center's opening ceremony was attended by representatives from governments, human rights organizations, and migrant worker communities across Africa and Asia. But the most meaningful moment came when a group of elderly women from Amara's village in Nigeria traveled to Kuwait to participate in the dedication. "Your mother's sacrifice has given voice to thousands of women who have suffered in silence," said Amara's childhood friend, now a grandmother herself. "But more than that, she has shown that love can transcend death, that justice can overcome any conspiracy, and that the seeds of healing can grow even in the harshest ground." As the sun set over the ceremony, Rashid and Zara found themselves standing exactly where their first therapy session had taken place, in the room that Amara's spirit had somehow arranged for them to meet. The space was now part of the memorial section of the center, featuring photographs of Amara's life and the evidence that had brought her killers to justice. "Do you think she knew?" Zara asked quietly. "Do you think she somehow understood that we would find each other?" Rashid considered the question seriously. "I think she understood something more important than that. She understood that love creates connections that survive any attempt to destroy them. She loved us both, and that love became the bridge that brought us together when we needed each other most." They stood in comfortable silence, surrounded by the sounds of children playing and families celebrating. The therapy room, where they had first discovered their connection, had been transformed into a space of hope and healing for others, a living memorial to a woman whose death had seemed to achieve nothing but had ultimately changed everything. The final entry in Amara's story was written not in the legal proceedings that brought her killers to justice, not in the newspaper headlines that vindicated her sacrifice, but in the love that had grown between the daughter she never got to raise and the boy she had helped shape into a man worthy of her faith. Justice for Zara Okafor had taken 34 years to achieve, but it had arrived exactly when it was needed most, carried by the hands that had learned to heal, guided by the hearts that had learned to love, and powered by the unbreakable truth that some bonds are stronger than death itself. In the end, the woman who had disappeared in the darkness of a Kuwaiti night had returned in the light of international justice. Her legacy transformed from a buried secret into a beacon of hope for all those who refused to let the powerful silence the innocent. And in a therapy room that had become a sanctuary, where healing had led to love and love had led to justice, the gentle hands that had once taught a lonely boy to count in Igbo had finally found their way home. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.